On my 27th birthday, I did not just lose my fiancé. I lost my sister, my family, and the illusion that I was safe in love. The evening began like a scene from a carefully curated dream, the kind where the city skyline glitters through floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and every guest raises a crystal flute in your honor. The penthouse was alive with the hum of conversation and the low thrum of jazz from a hired quartet, their music mingling with the scent of peonies and champagne and the faint sweetness of the cake waiting near the corner table. For months, I had planned every detail down to the shade of the candles and the seating chart that placed people together in ways that would spark warmth, not conflict. I had worn a silk gown, the color of midnight, cut to skim my frame without apology. My hair swept into a knot that felt regal but not untouchable. Daniel Brooks stood beside me, looking every bit the polished attorney who had once sworn to fight for me in every way that mattered. He smiled when our eyes met, and for a moment I believed in the life we were building together. This was supposed to be the night we announced the date of our wedding to our closest friends and family, a night to look forward to, not a night to survive. The first hour passed in a haze of laughter toasts, and the clinking of glassware people leaned in close to tell me how radiant I looked and how lucky Daniel was, and I smiled because I had no reason yet to suspect the ground beneath me was about to crack. Then Daniel touched my arm lightly, his fingers a whisper against my skin, and murmured in a tone meant only for me, "Emily, could we step outside for a moment?" I thought perhaps he had planned a private surprise, maybe another ring, maybe a quiet vow, so I followed him through the sliding glass doors onto the balcony. The air was cool, the city stretching below us in a wash of light and shadow. "What is it?" I asked. Half laughing, but his face did not match mine. His jaw was set, his eyes restless. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a confession he could not soften. "Emily, I cannot marry you." His words landed with the weight of a gavel ending a trial I had not even known I was part of. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. He went on before I could speak. "I am in love with someone else. It happened unexpectedly. We did not mean for it to." I felt my breath stutter and the muscles in my chest tighten so hard I thought I might split apart. Who I asked not because I wanted to know, but because some part of me still believed the name would make sense. Daniel looked away, his gaze settling on the street far below Rebecca. He said softly, "The name did not just register it." Exploded Rebecca, my older sister, the one who had been the golden child in our family, the one our mother praised, as though she could do no wrong. The one who smiled at me in photographs like she had nothing to prove and everything to protect. My knees felt unsteady, the cold from the balcony railing seeping into my palms as I gripped it. "You are telling me you are leaving me for my sister?" He nodded, his face pinched with what I could only guess was guilt, though it sat on him awkwardly like a borrowed coat. "And she is pregnant," he added, as if the knife could twist any deeper. I could not hear the music anymore, only the rush of blood in my ears, the world tilting in slow, sickening motion. I stepped back from him, each inch a deliberate retreat, until my spine met the glass door. I did not wait for him to explain. I did not want the details of how long they had been lying to me, How easily they had smiled in my presence while building their own future in the shadows. I slid the door open and stepped back inside the warmth of the room. Hit me, but it felt like stepping into another climate, entirely where the air was thick with the scent of betrayal and the press of eyes. I moved through the crowd on legs that felt borrowed. Guests turned to look, their laughter dimming into confusion. As I reached the center of the room, the doors on the opposite side opened, and in she walked Rebecca Hart, glowing under the chandeliers. Her hair was styled in waves, her black velvet dress molding to the curve of her body, and most notably to the swell of her stomach. She walked as if she owned not only the room, but the story being written within it. Her eyes found mine, and there was no flicker of hesitation, no apology. She smiled the slow, unhurried smile of someone arriving exactly when they meant to. Daniel entered behind her looking like a man who had already chosen his side. They came to a stop near the table, where our mother sat in a posture as precise as her pearl necklace. Rebecca placed a hand over her stomach, and in a voice pitched to carry across the room, announced, "Daniel and I are engaged, and we are expecting our first child." The silence that followed was not complete. It was punctuated by the collective intake of breath from dozens of people. Someone dropped a fork. A guest near me whispered, "Oh my God." I searched for my mother's face, hoping for even a flicker of disapproval or concern, but found only the tightening of her mouth as she adjusted the pearls at her throat. "No scene," she mouthed. Rebecca's earrings caught the light. They were our late grandmother's, a gift meant for me. Rebecca had admired them once years ago, but I had never imagined she would take them as she had taken everything else. In that instant, I felt something inside me shift, a fracture that was not just about Daniel or Rebecca, but about every unspoken rule in our family that had told me to be smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. I reached down and slipped off my heels, the silk hem of my dress brushing the tops of my bare feet. I turned without another word, without even the courtesy of a goodbye, and walked toward the elevator. No one followed me, not Daniel, not Rebecca, not my mother. As the doors closed, I saw their faces, a tableau of victory and silence, and I knew I could not stay, not for another minute. The city's night air wrapped around me as I stepped out into the street, still barefoot, the concrete cool against my skin, and the lights above blurring into something I could not yet name, but would one day recognize as the first breath of freedom. The rain began as a mist, a whisper against my bare shoulders. By the time I reached the parking garage, it had settled into a steady drizzle that turned the concrete floor into a mirror of fractured light. My heels were still clutched in my hand, the silk gown heavy with the dampness in the air, and I could feel the tremor in my fingers as I unlocked the door to my car. I slid into the driver's seat without looking back, the image of Rebecca's smile still etched behind my eyes, and turned the key with a sharp twist. The engine hummed, the dashboard lights flickered on, and with that, I pulled out of the space and into the dark veins of the city. I did not know where I was going, only that I could not go home. Not to the apartment that still smelled of Daniel's cologne and held the ring he had slipped on my finger, like a promise he never intended to keep. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, a cascade of texts from people at the party. From numbers I recognized, and some I did not, and I pressed the power button until the screen went black. The road, slick with rain, reflected the streetlights in long yellow ribbons, the city fading behind me in the rearview mirror, until it was only a smear of gold and shadow. I drove past the bridge and into the expanse of highway, the windshield wipers keeping rhythm with the pounding of my pulse, each mile an unspooling of the life I had known. Somewhere outside the city limits, the air changed cooler and sharper, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, and I lowered the window enough to let it in, needing to feel something real against my skin. The GPS sat dark, no destination set, and I let the road decide for me. Hours passed in a blur of exit signs and gas stations, my mind replaying the scene again and again until it felt like a cruel loop I could not shut off. The balcony, his voice, her dress, my mother's pearls. Each detail etched in painful clarity. Near dawn, the sky shifted from black to the muted gray of early morning, and a road sign announced Seaside Cliffs, a town I had only heard of once in a travel article about quiet places where the ocean still roared louder than traffic. I turned off the highway almost without thinking, following the narrow road that wound through tall cliffs draped in fog, the sound of waves growing louder with every curve. The town revealed itself slowly, a scattering of weathered buildings with salt-worn paint, a harbor lined with fishing boats swaying gently in the tide, and a stretch of beach that seemed to go on forever. I found a small cabin for rent above a surf shop, its sign tilted slightly, as if the wind had been testing it for years, and paid the first month in cash to a landlord who barely looked up from his newspaper. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar, and the floorboards creaked with each step, and the water from the tap ran brown for a few seconds before clearing, but it was mine. I set my shoes in the corner, draped my damp gown over the back of a chair, and wrapped myself in the knitted scarf I had grabbed in haste from the coat rack before leaving the party, a scarf the color of deep ocean, the only thing on me that felt warm. I stood at the window, watching the mist roll in from the water, the horizon barely visible, and for the first time in hours my breathing slowed. There were no calls to return, no eyes watching for my reaction, no stage to stand on. I made a bed from the thin blankets in the closet and lay there listening to the waves break in the distance. Each crash a reminder that the world was still moving forward, even if I felt frozen in place. When I woke, it was afternoon, and sunlight cut through the fog in thin beams, lighting the dust in the air like suspended stars. I walked down to the beach barefoot, the scarf trailing in the wind, and let the cold water lap at my toes until they went numb. The ocean did not care who I was or what I had left behind. It only knew how to arrive and retreat again and again, no matter what it carried. Standing there with the wind tangling my hair and the salt on my lips, I realized I had no plan, no job, no one expecting me to walk back through a door I had just closed forever. And somehow that thought was less terrifying than it should have been. I turned away from the shore and began walking back toward the cabin, the sound of the waves at my back like a pulse I could borrow until I found my own again. The first week in Seaside Cliffs passed in a kind of muted blur, each day shaped by the sound of the ocean and the smell of salt that clung to my clothes. No matter how often I washed them, the cabin was small enough that I could cross from one end to the other in less than 20 steps, and the windows rattled when the wind came in from the west. But there was a strange comfort in the imperfections, as if they were proof that this place had survived its own share of storms. The mornings began with the gulls calling from the rocks, and the sight of fishermen loading their boats at the harbor, their voices low and rough from years of speaking over wind and waves. I would make coffee in the dented percolator left in the cupboard, wrap myself in the deep ocean scarf, and stand on the porch, watching the mist lift slowly from the water until the line between sea and sky was clear again. On the third day, I walked into town, a cluster of weathered storefronts with hand-painted signs and flower boxes that leaned toward the sun. The largest building on the main street was a cafe called Harbor Brew. Its windows steamed from the warmth inside, and the smell of roasted beans spilled out every time the door opened. I pushed it open and was met by the sight of a woman in her 60s behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back in a braid, and her eyes the sharp blue of winter skies. She looked me over once and said in a voice that held both command and kindness, "You looking for coffee or a job?" And when I hesitated, she added, "We could use another pair of hands, the tourist season's coming." By the end of the afternoon, I had an apron, a place on the morning shift, and the kind of exhaustion that came from being on my feet. For hours after weeks of emotional collapse, Margaret, as she introduced herself, was not one for unnecessary questions. She showed me how to work the espresso machine, how to balance 3 plates at once without dropping any, and how to spot a customer who was ready for their check without them having to wave. The other employees were locals, 2 college students home for the summer, and a man in his 40s who delivered pastries from the bakery down the street. They welcomed me with the easy warmth of people who did not expect a performance in return. My first paycheck was modest, but it felt like an anchor proof that I was building something again, even if it was small. In the evenings, I began to walk along the shore with a sketchbook I had bought from a tiny shop that smelled of paper and turpentine, the pages slowly filling with lines and colors that had no audience but me. Sometimes I painted the waves, sometimes the lighthouse at the far end of the bay, and sometimes shapes I could not name, but knew came from places in me that had been locked away for too long. I found a rhythm in the quiet, my hands learning the motions of serving coffee in the morning and mixing paints at night, the cabin's single table, covered with brushes, jars of cloudy water, and scraps of paper stained with test strokes. Margaret noticed the paint under my nails one morning and asked if I was an artist when I told her I had studied fine arts before life took a different turn. She nodded like she already knew, and 2 days later, she cleared a space on the cafe wall and told me to bring in one of my pieces. I chose a painting of the beach at dawn, the tide low, the scarf trailing in the sand, as if it had been carried there by the wind. When she hung it near the register, customers began to comment on it. Some asked if I sold my work, others just said it made them feel calm. The validation was a quiet one, but it planted something in me. A reminder that I was more than the sum of what had been taken from me. On my days off, I explored the edges of the town. The cliffs where the wind came so strong it could pull the breath from your chest, the the small library with its crooked shelves, and a cat that slept in the sun by the window. The market that sold fish so fresh they still smelled of the ocean, and a narrow path through the dunes that led to a cove hidden from the main beach. I spoke to people in passing, but never about where I had come from or why I was simply Emily, the new girl at Harbor Brew, who painted in her spare time. At night, I sometimes lay awake, listening to the storm when it came in off the water, the rain drumming against the roof in a way that felt like a heartbeat, the thunder rolling over the cliffs, and I would pull the scarf tighter around me, not because the cabin was cold, but because it had become my reminder that I had left, that I had chosen to walk away. By the end of the first month, my hands had grown used to the rhythm of work again. My smile no longer felt like a mask every time a customer said thank you, and the mirror in the cabin reflected someone whose eyes no longer carried the constant shadow of that night in the city. I was not healed, not yet, but the edges of the wound were no longer raw, and in their place was a slow, quiet growth, the kind you do not notice, until one morning you wake and realize the air feels different, lighter, somehow. That was the morning I saw him for the first time, though I would not know then how much his presence would matter. A man standing at the end of the pier with a camera in his hands, the wind pulling at his jacket, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he was trying to catch something the rest of us could not see. I remember thinking he looked like someone who knew how to be still in a world that never stopped moving. And then I turned back toward the cafe, unaware that our paths would cross sooner than I could imagine. It was a rainy afternoon when I first spoke to him, the kind of rain that softened the outlines of everything and made the air taste like salt and steel. Harbor Brew was warm and crowded with people seeking shelter. Steam fogged the windows, and the smell of cinnamon from the fresh scones mingled with the deep aroma of coffee. I was moving between tables with a tray balanced on one hand, when the door opened and he stepped inside his jacket. Damp, a camera hanging from a strap across his chest, and a book tucked under one arm. He shook the water from his hair before glancing around the room, his eyes scanning for an empty seat. There was one near the corner by the bookshelf, and he made his way toward it with an ease that drew no attention. But mine, when I brought over a menu, he smiled in a way that was quiet but certain, and ordered a pot of chamomile tea. I noticed his hands as he reached for the menu. Long fingers, nails trimmed short, the faintest smudge of graphite near his thumb, as if he had been sketching before the rain began. When I returned with his tea, he had already set the book aside and was looking out the window at the street, where the rain streaked down in silver lines. He thanked me, and his voice was lower than I expected. Steady but edged with something that felt like distance, the kind you carry when you have been away from the world for a while. An hour later, when I was wiping down the counter, I noticed he had left. But on the chair lay a black sketchbook, the kind with a worn spine and pages thick enough to hold ink without bleeding. I picked it up to set aside, and the cover fell open to a drawing that made me still. It was the view from the end of the pier at Seaside Cliffs, the same place I had seen him standing a week ago. The horizon wide and endless, the water shaded in deep blues and grays, and in the lower corner, my scarf fluttering on the rail. As if it had been caught by the wind, my name was not written anywhere, but I knew it was mine. The next morning, he came back just after we opened the cafe, still half empty, and the smell of fresh grounds filling the air. He walked straight to the counter, the sketchbook in his hands, and said with a small smile, "I think I left this behind." I nodded and told him I had kept it safe, resisting the urge to mention the scarf. He introduced himself as Ethan, and we spoke only briefly about the weather, about how the rain here seemed to arrive without warning. And then he ordered another pot of tea and took the same seat by the bookshelf. Over the next few weeks, he returned never on a schedule I could predict, but often enough that I began to expect him. Sometimes he brought the camera and left it on the table while he read, sometimes the sketchbook, sometimes nothing but his quiet presence. And each time we spoke a little more, never about anything heavy. Just the kind of conversations that fill space gently like warm air. In a cold room, he asked about the paintings on the wall, and I told him Margaret had hung one of mine. He studied it for a long time and said it looked like a moment you could step into and never leave. I asked if he was a photographer, and he shrugged, said he liked to look at things until they made sense to him, and sometimes he took pictures. One afternoon, near closing time, he stayed as I stacked chairs and wiped tables, and when the last customer left, he asked if I had time to walk with him. To the pier, the rain had stopped and the air smelled of wet wood and seaweed. The tide was high, the waves breaking against the rocks below in white bursts. We leaned on the railing and watched the sun drop lower until the water turned to molten gold. I told him I came here to start over. He did not ask, from what he only said, that sometimes starting over was the bravest thing you could do. That night when I returned to the cabin, I realized how rare it had become for me to feel at ease around someone I barely knew. Rarer still to feel no need to fill the silence between us. It was a silence that felt shared, not empty, and I found myself looking forward to the next time the bell over the cafe door would ring, and he would walk in out of the rain. The days began to fold into each other with the rhythm of tide and light mornings at Harbor Brew, with the hiss of the espresso machine and the clink of mugs on the counter afternoons that sometimes brought Ethan through the door with rain on his jacket or the scent of the wind in his hair. He never stayed for long, but when he did, it was as if the cafe shifted subtly, the chatter softer, the air easier to breathe. We started to talk in fragments that built into something steadier, not about the past, not yet, but about small things, the way the gulls seemed to fight over scraps. Even when the tide was generous, the bakery down the street that sold cherry tarts, only on Thursdays the light on the water just before a storm rolled in. One slow morning when Margaret had gone to the market and the others were on break, I offered him a second cup of tea on the house. He raised an eyebrow and said that if I was giving away tea, I should let him return the favor somehow. When I asked what he had in mind, he pointed at the old espresso machine and said it sounded like it was choking every time I pulled a shot. He spent 20 minutes with a small toolkit he carried in his bag, and when he finished, the machine purred instead of groaned. Margaret later declared it was working better than it had in years. The exchange became a kind of pattern. He would fix or carry something for me, and in return, I would draw for him small sketches of the harbor or the view from the pier. Once I drew his hands holding his camera and slid the page into his sketchbook. Without a word, he found it later and gave me a look that held more warmth than any sentence could carry. Sometimes on my breaks, we would walk to the pier or along the beach. His camera clicking at details I had stopped noticing: a curl of rope on the dock, the shadow of a pelican on the water, the reflection of my scarf in a tide pool. One windy afternoon, we sheltered under the overhang of the lighthouse keeper's shed while rain swept sideways across the bay, our shoulders almost touching, but neither of us moving away. He told me he had lived in many places but never stayed anywhere long. I asked if he liked that kind of life, and he said it was easier to keep from belonging. I told him belonging was not always a trap. Sometimes it was an anchor. He gave me a look like he wanted to believe that. As weeks passed, I found myself telling him more bits of my life in the city, without naming it, how I had once thought I had everything I needed, only to watch it vanish in a single night. How the ocean had been the only thing I could think of when I had to run. He listened without interrupting, without offering advice, and in return, he told me about a childhood that had been spent in boarding schools and summer houses where the rooms were always full but never warm, about the pressure of being known for a name before you had done anything to earn it yourself. And though I did not fully understand what he meant, I could hear the weariness in his voice when he said it. One evening near closing time, a storm cut the power to the town. The cafe went dark except for the candles we found in the supply closet. We stayed open for the handful of customers who lingered, serving coffee brewed on a gas stove and laughing when the wind rattled the windows. Ethan stayed until the last candle burned low, walking me back to the cabin with the scarf wrapped twice around my neck, the rain light but cold, and before we reached the porch, he stopped and said quietly that it had been a long time since he had wanted to stay anywhere. The words lingered in the air between us like the taste of salt. I wanted to ask if that meant here with me, but I kept the question to myself, afraid of the answer either way. At the cabin door he hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the sea as if he could see something out there in the dark. Then he wished me good night and walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hum of the waves. Over the next few days, I caught myself looking for him in the cafe, listening for the bell over the door, feeling a small drop of disappointment when it rang for someone else. But when he finally appeared again, it was as though no time had passed. He slid into the corner seat, ordered his tea, and asked if I wanted to join him on the pier after my shift. I said yes, before I even thought about it. That afternoon the tide was low, and the sandbars stretched far into the bay, the sun dipping toward the horizon. He handed me his camera and told me to take a picture of anything I wanted. I lifted it to my eye and framed the scarf blowing in the wind at the edge of the pier, the water catching the light in fractured gold. When I lowered the camera, he was watching me, with an expression that made my chest tighten, something between curiosity and recognition, as if he could see the person I was. Before the night that had driven me here, and maybe even the person I was becoming. It happened on a clear morning in late September, the kind of morning when the air feels thinner, as if the season is about to turn. I had taken my sketchbook down to the marina, to capture the reflection of the fishing boats in the still water. The cafe was slow that day, and Margaret had insisted I take a few hours for myself. I was crouched near the dock when I noticed movement along the boardwalk. Not the usual handful of locals or tourists, but two men with cameras slung around their necks, the long lenses scanning the crowd like hunters searching for something specific, or someone my first thought was that they looked like paparazzi. The kind I had only seen in the city, the kind that had no reason to be here in Seaside Cliffs. I followed the line of their gaze and felt my stomach dip when it landed on Ethan. He was standing a few yards away, wearing his usual dark hoodie and jeans. His hands shoved into his pockets, his jaw tight. I could see the moment he noticed them too, the way his shoulders tensed and his eyes darted toward the narrow alley between two shops without thinking. I gathered my things and moved toward him by the time I reached the corner. He was leaning against the brick wall, his breath visible in the cool air. He looked at me for a long moment before saying quietly, "They found me." I asked who they were, though I already suspected. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a short laugh that held no amusement. "I should have told you sooner, Emily. My name isn't just Ethan. It's Ethan Colwell." The words meant nothing until he added, CEO of Colwell Technologies. "I'm the guy you'd find if you Googled hard enough." "Not that I recommend it," he said, leaning back against the wall. The name was familiar, even to me, a company worth billions. The kind of name that filled headlines and magazine covers. And suddenly, the camera, the sketches, the way he had seemed to avoid talking about his past, made sense. I felt the air shift between us, a weight settling in my chest. "You lied to me," I said, and though my voice was calm, it carried the sharp edge of something I had fought hard to bury. He shook his head. "I didn't lie, I just didn't tell you everything. People chase me for money, for power, for proximity. I wanted to know what it felt like to meet someone who saw me. Without all that noise, I came here under a different name because I needed to disappear for a while." I folded my arms, my scarf pulled tight around my neck, as if I could hide inside it. "And what if I'd done the same?" I asked. "What if I'd hidden who I was?" "You didn't," he said simply. "You never asked me for a thing. You never treated me like an opportunity. That's how I knew you were different." His words should have soothed something in me, but they didn't. Instead, they scraped against the old wounds of a night when trust had been shattered in public and left to bleed in silence. I told him I had run from a life where someone I loved had lied to me and chosen someone else. I had built walls to keep that kind of pain out. And now here he was standing on the wrong side of those walls. I can't survive lies twice. "Ethan," I said. He stepped closer, but not close enough to touch me. "I understand," he said. "I'll give you space." And then he walked away down the alley, the photographers still scanning the boardwalk for him. I stood there for a long time with the gulls wheeling overhead and the sound of the tide pulling back from the shore. The sketchbook heavy in my bag, the scarf warm against my skin, and a feeling I hated, tightening in my chest, the sense that someone I had begun to trust had just become another name on the list of people I could not let back in. The days after that conversation felt heavier. The air in Seaside Cliffs seemed colder, though the weather had not changed. I went to work at Harbor Brew and went home without lingering at the pier, without looking toward the door. When the bell rang, Ethan did not come in, and I told myself it was for the best. Distance was safer, distance was familiar. I poured myself into painting, as if filling the canvas could empty the ache from my chest. Each stroke sharper than the last, the scarf draped over the back of my chair like a silent witness to my resolve. A week passed before anything broke the pattern. It was early morning when I found the package on the cafe counter. Margaret said a man had dropped it off before opening. There was no name on the brown paper, only my initials written in dark ink. I carried it to the back room and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a canvas. My breath caught when I saw it. It was my painting of the pier, the one I had kept in the cabin, but it was different, reimagined in stronger lines and deeper colors. The sky layered with shades of gold and storm gray. The water restless but alive, and in the corner, the scarf not trailing abandoned, but caught in mid-air, as if carried upward by the wind. Taped to the back was a small note in Ethan's handwriting. Even the coldest seas can carry you somewhere warm. I stood there holding it, the smell of coffee. Drifting in from the front, my pulse loud in my ears. Part of me wanted to set it aside and pretend it meant nothing, that I had not missed his presence, but the truth pressed against me like the tide I had missed. It missed him not because of who he was in the world, but because of who he was here with me, the man who fixed the espresso machine. Without being asked, who walked with me in the rain, without trying to fill the silence, who saw me without asking for more than I could give. That evening after my shift, I found myself walking toward the pier. The sky low with clouds, the water dark and churning. He was there leaning against the railing, his camera slung at his side. When he saw me, he straightened but did not move closer. I told him I had received his painting. He nodded once and said he meant every word. I asked him why he had come to Seaside Cliffs in the first place, and this time he told me the truth about the corporate boardroom battles, the friends who had turned into opportunists, the way his name had become a currency that bought him everything except peace. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I said quietly that I still did not know if I could trust him. But I wanted to try. The wind lifted my scarf between us, a strip of color in the gray, and he reached out slowly as if asking permission. Before catching it in his hand, he let it go again and said, "I will never hide from you again, Emily. Not even the parts I am not proud of." I believed him enough to stay there with him until the light faded, and the lamps along the boardwalk flickered on enough to walk beside him back toward town without the weight in my chest pulling me away. The weeks that followed were quieter but different. The kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from understanding. Ethan began coming to the cafe again, sometimes with his camera, sometimes with just that calm presence that had drawn me in. From the start, we walked more often, sometimes along the pier, sometimes to the hidden cove where the cliffs broke the wind. We spoke about the small things, but now there was space for the larger truths too. The fragments of our pasts no longer hidden behind careful pauses. He told me about the first camera he ever owned, a gift from his grandfather, and how he had taken pictures of empty fields and quiet streets long before anyone knew his name. I told him about the art school I had left behind, the pieces I had abandoned because they no longer felt like mine. And in those exchanges, I felt something like trust take root again. Winter turned to spring, the air softened, and one afternoon while we were sitting on the weathered bench near the lighthouse, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring. Not a diamond, but a band of silver with a single sea glass stone. The color of my scarf. He said he did not want a grand gesture or an audience. He just wanted to know if I would choose to stay. I said yes because I already had. We planned nothing elaborate, no long guest list, no staged photos. Just a ceremony on the cliffs with the ocean stretching endlessly behind us. Margaret stood with us as the only witness, her hands clasped in front of her, and her smile warm despite the wind. I wore a simple linen dress, and my scarf not as armor, but as a piece of the journey that had brought me here. Ethan wore a navy suit with the collar open, the sea glass ring in his pocket, until the moment he slipped it onto my finger. His hands steady, his voice low as he promised to never disappear into silence again. The waves below crashed against the rocks, as if marking the vows with their own rhythm. And when we kissed, it was slow and sure, a sealing of something we had both fought to keep. Afterward, we sat on a blanket with bread from the bakery and a bottle of wine we had bought that morning. The light turning gold across the water. The sound of gulls overhead, the wind tangling my hair. I remember thinking that this was what I had needed all along. Not spectacle, not approval, but peace, the kind that comes from standing next to someone who sees you exactly as you are and stays anyway. We danced later on the narrow path above the cove, no music except the rush of the tide and the sound of our own laughter, his arm around my waist, my head resting against his chest, the scarf caught once on a branch and freed with a soft tug, like a reminder that even the things that try to hold you back can be let go. That night, as we returned to the cabin, the air cool and smelling of salt, I felt lighter than I had in years, the weight of that night in the city still a part of me, but no longer defining the shape of my days. I had not forgotten what had happened, but I had built something new in its place, and that felt like the truest kind of victory. It was almost 3 years. After the wedding, when the envelope arrived, tucked between bills and flyers, in the small metal box outside the cabin, I nearly threw it into the stack without looking until the weight of the paper caught my attention. Thick and expensive, my name written in elegant calligraphy. Emily Hart, no middle name, no return address. Inside was a cream card bordered in gold. You are cordially invited to a birthday celebration in honor of Rebecca Hart. The Belmont Hotel, Manhattan. Formal attire, no cameras. I read it twice and set it on the table. The tide was out, and the air in the cabin felt tight. I had not seen Rebecca since the night I left the city barefoot. The idea of walking into her world again was not something I had ever planned yet. The card sat there like a dare. For days I told myself I would ignore it, that I had no interest in reopening a chapter I had closed so completely, but the thought kept circling back. Not because I wanted revenge, but because part of me wanted to stand in that kind of room again, not as the woman they had discarded, but as the one I had become. One morning before dawn, I woke with the decision fully formed. I would go not for her, not for them, for me. I told Ethan over coffee a week later as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the green velvet dress I had chosen the slit. High enough to move easily, the cut precise. I'm not going for her, I said. I'm going for me. He leaned in the doorway, watching me. You're sure? Yes, I said. Not armor precision. He smiled faintly. I'll be right beside you, even if you burn the place down. I smiled back. Oh, I won't burn it. I'll just show them what healing looks like. The Belmont was all polished marble and chandeliers. The kind of place where sound seemed to glide instead of echo. The valet took our keys without looking twice. At the black car, Ethan drove the hostess at the entrance, froze for a moment when I gave my name. Hart, I added, and then after a pause, Colwell, her expression shifted, and she led us down a hall of the double doors of the dining room. They opened to a space lit like a film set. Candles flickering down a long table, crystal and silver gleaming, the hum of conversation dropping to a hush as we stepped inside. Rebecca was near the head of the table, a glass of champagne in hand. Mid-laugh, she froze when she saw me, the sound dying in her throat. I walked forward slowly, the dress catching the light in deep emerald. Ethan beside me with one hand at the small of my back. His smile polite but distant. Someone whispered his name, and I felt the ripple move through the room. My sister's face paled, but she recovered quickly. Emily, she said at last. You came. You invited me, I replied. She glanced to her side. I didn't, then maybe your assistant did. I said, nice turnout. Silence followed, thick enough to touch. She looked older than I remembered, her hair perfect, her dress couture, but there were shadows under her eyes. No amount of makeup could hide. I took my seat halfway down the table, Ethan beside me, the low murmur of conversation returning in broken fragments. Courses came and went, the air-taut forks set down carefully, eyes flicking toward me and away. Rebecca avoided my gaze, except for fleeting moments when she seemed to be calculating something she could not quite name. I watched her daughter now, 3 quietly arranging peas on her plate. Daniel nowhere in sight. When dessert was cleared, I rose, the sound of my chair sliding back. Drawing every head I know, this isn't on the agenda. I began, my voice carrying easily in the hush, but since I've been invited back into the room I was once shoved out of, I think it's time I said a few things. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Her hands still in her lap, 3 years ago on a night, not so different from this. I was celebrating my birthday, my engagement. I thought I had love, security, a future, and in one evening my fiancé ended it, and a few minutes later I found out why I turned to her. It was you. You stood in front of my guests, our family, and announced you were carrying his child, that you two would be married instead. You didn't apologize, not once. You smiled, you acted like you had won. My voice dropped, but the words struck harder. You didn't win anything. You stole what you didn't even want to keep. The room was so still I could hear the faint hiss of the candles. I let the pause stretch when I left that night. I walked out without a coat, without a plan, without a home, and none of you followed. Not you, not Mom. Not a single friend who claimed to care, but leaving was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to find myself, to choose myself. I turned slightly, catching Ethan's steady gaze at the far end, and in doing that, I found love again, not the kind that disappears the moment it's tested, not the kind that trades commitment for comfort. I found something real. I'm not here tonight to humiliate you, Rebecca. I'm here because healing deserves an audience, and the truth deserves a seat at the table. I forgive you, but forgiveness is not an invitation. It's not a key back into my life. It's a sign that I've locked the door for my peace, not your comfort. And to every person who watched me fall and said nothing, don't reach for me, now that I've learned how to stand. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Rebecca rose slowly, her hands trembling just enough to notice her voice. Lower than I had ever heard it. I'm sorry, she said, but the words felt too small against the years between us. I nodded. I believe you, but believing you doesn't mean trusting you. I glanced at her daughter. I hope she grows up to be the kind of woman who never has to beg for space at her own table. The child blinked at me solemnly, sensing more than she could understand. I stepped back. Ethan moved toward me, his hand warm at my back, and together we walked out, not hurried, not shaken, just finished the sound of the doors closing behind us. Like a final line written at the end of a chapter I no longer needed to revisit. Outside, the air was damp with the promise of rain, the city humming softly around us. Ethan asked nothing, said nothing, and I was grateful the silence between us, full of everything I had wanted to say for years and had finally spoken aloud. The night air wrapped around us as we walked from the Belmont, the street lamps casting long shadows across the slick pavement, the rain still holding itself in the clouds as if waiting for us to leave the city. We did not speak until we were inside the car, and even then it was only a glance, the kind of look that says everything without needing words. The hotel and the faces inside it already beginning to feel like a distant echo. Something I had stepped into only to prove to myself that I could walk out whole. At the hotel later that night, I stood on the balcony, the lights of Manhattan glittering below, like a field of restless stars. Ethan came up behind me, his arms warm around my waist. How do you feel? He asked. Clean, I said, like I finally put down a weight. I did not know I was still carrying you, didn't just survive them. He murmured against my hair. You outgrew them. By morning we were at the airport, the terminal quiet in the early hour. The smell of coffee drifting from the kiosk by the gate. I watched the planes move slowly across the tarmac and felt no urge to look back. Rebecca and my mother had both asked for a moment after the dinner. We had stood just outside the hotel entrance, under the awning while the wind teased the edge of my scarf. Rebecca had been the first to speak. I deserved everything you said. She told me, and more. I was jealous of you long before Daniel. I thought taking him would make me feel like I had won. But I didn't love him, I just didn't want you to have something. I didn't. He left me 6 months after the baby was born. She paused, her voice thinning. I've been alone for 2 years, and tonight I saw what you've become, and I realized the person I hurt the most wasn't you. It was me. I told her I forgave her not for her sake, but for mine. But forgiveness was not an invitation, it was the closing of a door. She nodded, tears in her eyes, but no protest. My mother stepped forward. Then her shawl pulled tight, her voice unsteady. I failed you, Emily. I cared more about keeping our family from embarrassment than protecting my daughter from betrayal. I told myself you were strong enough to handle it. I asked her if she had ever considered that maybe I shouldn't have had to be strong. She lowered her gaze. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm asking for your peace. I told her I forgave her too, but I didn't want either of them in my life. No birthday cards, no coffee, catch-ups, no polite versions of love. This wasn't punishment, it was protection. She seemed to understand, and we left it there. The three of us standing in the soft glow of the city, each carrying our own version of the truth. Back in Seaside Cliffs, life slipped easily into its familiar rhythm, the cabin, the cafe, the sea. I began painting with a new kind of energy, not to heal anymore, but to create from a place that felt whole. Margaret suggested I turn the extra room above the surf shop into a gallery. We opened Heart Studio 6 months later. The walls filled with canvases that told the story without naming it. Seascapes with scarves caught in the wind. Harbors lit in the gold of late afternoon. Faceless figures walking into the tide and returning changed. I started running workshops for women who had been told they were too much or not enough. We painted, we talked, sometimes we said nothing at all, letting the brushes carry what words could not. Ethan took photos of the gallery for the website, but refused to let any of them include him. "This is yours," he said, and I knew he meant it. Reporters came eventually, drawn by the growing attention around the studio. They tried to pull the old story from me, the betrayal, the sister, the fiancé, but I never gave them the names, I never even said the city. I told them only that some storms strip you bare, so you can see what's worth rebuilding. Our home was a low, sun-washed place outside of town, framed by wild jasmine and olive trees. Mornings were slow with coffee and the sound of the gulls' afternoons. Spent with him editing photos on his laptop, and me bent over a canvas. Sometimes we would walk the beach at sunset, our hands brushing the scarf around my shoulders. Catching the last light, I kept it not as a wound, but as a marker of the day I chose myself. On my 30th birthday, I stood at the edge of the water, the tide curling cool over my feet, a folded piece of paper in my hand. It was a letter to the woman I had been at 27. You were never too soft, you were never foolish for believing in love. They were fools for thinking they could break you and still define who you would become. Look at you now. Look at how you lived. I placed the letter inside a glass bottle and let it drift into the waves, watching it bob once before the sea carried it away. Sometimes I still saw Rebecca in the news, a feature on her charity work, an interview about the challenges of single motherhood. My mother had retreated from the public eye, showing up only at a few fundraisers. They sent cards on holidays. I never opened them. At night, I would lie beside Ethan and think about the woman who walked barefoot out of that party. the one who thought she had lost everything. And I would realize she had no idea she was stepping into the life she was meant to have. Some stories must break before they can breathe. I had lost the world I thought was mine, but I had built one better from the pieces a life not just beautiful, but entirely mine. And that was everything I never knew I deserved.